Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. This week, I'm diving into a complicated and difficult topic, the emergence of slavery, and more specifically, chattel slavery in America. While not a new invention, the American colonies vastly changed the concept of slavery and would fight both a revolution and a civil war to protect its existence. So, when did slavery start in America? Why? Were Africans complicit in the sale of their fellow people? Was it always about race? All important questions I hope to dive into and answer today. So grab your coffee and let's begin. Commonly referred to as America's original sin, slavery is not an American invention. Around since the time of the Romans, slavery was never known for its fair or equitable treatment of those enslaved. However, most individuals serving as slaves were still considered people and not property. Historically, slaves mirrored indentured servitude, able to own property and marry and have intact families. While slavery in the colonies began primarily with indentured servants, it quickly evolved into a more grotesque and inhumane model of forced, lifelong, inherited bondage. Slavery in the New World would be marked by the dehumanization and cruelty inflicted on its captives. By the time the first African slaves were sold in Virginia in 1619, there were already over 1 million people in captivity, brought by the Portuguese and the Spanish. The need for labor in the colonies, both for survival and exporting goods, necessitated the need for hard labor. Unable and often unwilling to work their own crops, the settlers had to find a cheap labor source to toil the fields. And while Columbus was able to enslave the Arawak tribe upon his arrival in 1492, the colonists found they were outnumbered and in a vast, unknown landscape, and were unable to bend the local tribesmen to their will. Lacking sufficient population and unable to coerce the local natives, the colonies looked towards importing a labor source. Most of the original workforce in the colonies were Englishmen who signed contracts to provide indentured labor for 5 to 7 years in exchange for the cost of passage to America. Long days with back-breaking work to cultivate the corn and tobacco crops, the colonies of the Chesapeake struggled to attract and maintain a strong labor force, even eventually relying on criminals sent from England who, instead of serving their sentence in prisons, were shipped off to the New World to perform manual labor. This indentured service provided landowners with the much-needed manpower and whet their appetite for expanding this workforce as quickly as possible. Further incentivizing expanding labor was the colonial concept of head right, which provided a title to a parcel of land for every family member or servant imported to the new colonies. So while the first African slaves who hit the English colonies in 1619 were purchased to help in the planting of the tobacco crop, indentured servants were still highly preferred, seen as an easier, cheaper method of free labor. In its infancy, the African slave trade was seen as costly and unreliable. Due to perhaps their limited number, most Africans were initially treated as the English, considered indentured servants required to serve a predetermined number of years, after which they were freed and given supplies to start their own lives. Many Africans were baptized before they left Africa, and per English custom, Christians could not enslave fellow Christians. As a result, freed Africans and Europeans socialized and built connections, leading to interracial relationships, marriages, and families. Historically, English common law stated a child's status followed their father, and the 1655 Virginia law stated, quote, "By the common law, the child of a woman slave by a free man ought to be free," end quote. Within a generation, the idea of blacks and whites being equal would disappear. Instituting a racial, not social caste system, laws were passed preventing the mixing of the races. These laws ensured social separation of whites from blacks and were aimed at preventing rebellion by servants and slaves alike. By 1662, the English would also alter their view of freedom for children, looking at the status of the mother when determining a newborn's fate, writing, quote, "All children born in this county shall be held, bond or free, only to the condition of the mother," end quote. This law ensured any child born to a female slave would be forced into a life of slavery and would act as a guaranteed labor source for the owner. The rape of female slaves by their owners would be widespread throughout the colonies, another disgusting and troubling consequence of slave laws. So, why were Africans selected to fill the labor need? Did they willingly participate in the sale of fellow Africans? Many tend to think of Africa as one monolithic country with little variation on identity and culture, and because of this, it seems preposterous that Africans would participate in the sale of their fellow countrymen. However, Africa was an established tribal nation containing thousands of self-sustaining kingdoms with as many varying languages and dialects. Like many European nations, African kings fought for power and land, often capturing members of rival tribes and forcing them into servitude. So when the Europeans came calling, African chiefs had disposable labor to trade for guns, ammunition, and other manufactured goods. This created and supported the slave trade triangle. Europeans trading manufactured goods for slave labor, slaves shipped to America, and the colonies trading slaves for manufactured goods. And while many Africans participated in the sale of men and women from other tribes, others did not. There were several kings who refused to participate in the trade and rebuked the Europeans' request. Like most events in history, there is a lot of gray. In writing on the contrast between African slavery and American slavery, Peter Colchin writes, quote, "Slaves there usually lived within the immediate households of their owners in an environment that was not altogether foreign to them. Slaves destined for America, by contrast, lost everything they knew, possessions, home, loved ones, and embarked on a new life in an alien world." End quote. When did importing Africans become a better option than indentured servants? It was a combination of a lack of servants wanting passage to America, thanks in small part to England's improving economy, and the increased presence of the British naval fleet, who soon dominated the slave trade, creating the Royal African Company in 1672. Purchasing slaves could also be seen as making economic sense. Slaves were bound to service for life, unlike indentured servants, and any female slave who bore children passed their status to their child, increasing the number of permanent free laborers for the owner. As a result, the number of African slave purchases steadily increased from 21,000 between 1620 and 1700 to 189,000 between 1701 and 1760. The evolution of viewing Africans as property and not just as indentured servants took only a few years and included a number of court cases and laws passed in the last half of the 17th century. The first case to establish chattel slavery, or the idea that a person could be considered property, was the John Punch case in Virginia in 1640. Serving a wealthy Virginia planter, Hugh Gwynn, John Punch ran away to Maryland with two other servants, a Dutchman and a Scotsman. Upon their capture, they were returned to Virginia to stand trial for their crimes in July of 1640. While the other two co-defendants saw their indentured service extended by just a few years, Punch was sentenced to life. In writing their decision, the General Court of Governor's Council wrote, quote, "And that the third, being a Negro named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life here or elsewhere." End quote. The Punch decision is considered the first time the colonies acknowledged the legality of slavery, thereby allowing the import of additional humans to be held in bondage. Throughout the next 40 years, a number of laws and codes were passed aimed at codifying slavery and separating Europeans from Africans. These include laws ensuring harsher treatment for any white person who assisted blacks in their escape, and a law passed in 1691 banning interracial marriage. Established in 1680 and strengthened in 1705, Virginia would enact the Slave Codes, a series of laws aimed at securing the legality of slavery. The Slave Codes included additional property rights for owners, protection of the trade of slaves, and the prohibition of blacks employing whites. By the American Revolution, each colony had its own set of distinct laws and rules governing slavery and the right to keep slaves. The initial need for survival and scarcity of free labor and the success of cash crops such as tobacco and cotton entrenched slavery's place within the colonies in the emerging country. As we will hear in future episodes, slavery became essential for economic success for many and would lead to an intense debate in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and future amendments. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.